versus movie. Movie versus movie. Movie versus movie. Movie versus movie.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Movie versus Movie. This is one of your hosts, Nick, and sitting across the computer from me is
Patrick. What is up, fans?
Yeah, woo, we're back, baby.
We need a name. What's the name for our fans?
Oh, I don't know.
We can think about it.
Maybe. Oh no. But I did just think of like if we like both movies equally, we should say that we're verse.
Definitely. I love that. Yeah. All right. We'll table the fan discussion. I think that was a productive. We can only have so much productive progress.
Yeah, if any
episode.
fan has like a real strong feeling of what they want to be called, feel free to email us. We'd love to adopt whatever name you give. Yeah, so we're back for our December episode, and as you all know, or maybe you don't if you don't listen to Culture Boys, we are going to be getting into the ice-cold mind of serial killers this month with 2 Korean movies. Patrick, you want to introduce them?
Yeah, this feels very kind of like prescient and topical of us because South Korea is very much in the news recently.
Yeah, man.
Due to the shortest coup in history. But we decided this before that all happened. But yeah, today we're going to be talking about 2 classic South Korean films. The first will be Memories of Murder, directed by Bong Joon-ho, about a unsolved at the time of release serial killer case, kind of a true crime adaptation. And then the second film will be Park Chan-wook's Lady Vengeance, which is a wild ride of a woman out for revenge against someone who's not so good.
Yeah, that's an understatement, but yes. I was so excited to watch both of these movies, and I don't think I was disappointed. Both of these movies were incredibly visceral. I personally have a pretty clear favorite, which we'll talk about at the end when we're choosing our winner. But it wasn't because like, oh, one movie's good and one movie is bad. It was more like one movie is just like the flavor that I like, and then the other one was not. So yeah. I'm very excited to talk about this with you. And we were talking off mic about what order we want to go in. We said that we could start up with Memories of Murder. Any initial thoughts or any like things that you want to talk about before we jump in?
Well, I think something else I realized last night, that's another thing these 2 movies have in common. I think they have a lot in common, which we'll talk about, including some of the actors. Another thing they have in common is they've both been featured on the YouTube channel Every Frame a Painting,
yes.
which I think we've bonded over, and I think for both of us was like formative in our like knowledge of movies, especially movies, foreign films or movies outside of like contemporary mainstream movies. So I think it's they've been featured in 2 different episodes, and I had seen both of these movies before. I know you hadn't, and so I'm curious to hear your reaction too, because I think I'm just talking about them, especially Lady Vengeance beforehand. I feel like that Every Frame a Painting video like really like struck a chord with you, and so I'm curious how the movie and kind of how like your impressions going in relate to the movie. But
I cannot wait to talk about that movie. Honestly, I can't wait to talk about both of these movies. Like Every Frame a Painting, which I think is just like required viewing if you're like a cinephile, or if you're like a film student. Definitely, it's like a free course on like specific shots or directors. Very, very cool. Go check it out. But yeah, these movies have been on my list forever, and being able to finally sit down and watch them was really, really nice. And Lady Vengeance, I actually watched by myself, and that was the first movie I've watched by myself in a while, and it was a great experience. So nice. I'm excited to talk about all of that too. So why don't we jump in with Memories of Murder? And I think that you should walk us through the plot and everything like that, and then I'll take Lady Vengeance because, like you said, I've sort of talked mad shit on the podcast about how much I love that video. So
Yeah, yeah, let's dive right in, because I have a lot to say about this movie, but I'll
Mhm.
I won't go too crazy with it. I was thinking this is like my Lady Bird, when we had our good friend Jamie on to talk about Lady Bird. Lady Bird's a movie that she loves and can talk endlessly about. And I feel this kind of feels like that movie for me, not to give away my feelings too early. But I think, so I had seen this movie twice before. I was trying to remember. I think I actually watched, because the director Bong Joon-ho,
of
directed
Parasite fame, if people don't know that, but
yeah, and had a couple American releases before that. So I think he was a relatively known quantity even before Parasite. But obviously, like, Parasite winning the Oscar really like thrust him into like upper echelon of directors. And so I was trying to remember. I was like, did I go back and watch this after Parasite? But I'm pretty sure I watched it before, probably knowing about it through like Every Frame of Painting, because I think I was already familiar with the actor Song Kang-ho by the time I saw Parasite. But I'd seen this movie twice before, and I think an incredible movie to watch, even if you have no context for South Korean history or politics, like that the movie's trafficking in. And like both
they're pretty
times,
universal. Like both of these movies have like very universal themes that the directors are wrestling with inside of these like little, very much more neat stories. You know what I mean?
yeah, and I feel like this one is able to communicate well the kind of political climate in South Korea at the time well enough to like understand what's going on, is like pretty efficient about that. But I decided, I was like, I should do a little bit of reading, just like understand specifically like where it was situated. And yeah, by no means an expert in South Korean history, but the general like historical context was like in the 70s through the 80s, South Korea was under a couple dictatorships that were established by military coups, and they faced pretty strong civilian opposition, especially from student protest movements like throughout them. And eventually the dictatorship was formally ended in 1988. But like in 1980, there was a massive uprising in Gwangju that the military killed a lot of civilian protesters. And so this movie takes place in 1986. So it's like, or it starts in 1986. So it's very much like the waning years of this dictatorship. It takes place in a rural part of Korea in like a time when Korea had started importing a lot of cheap agriculture. And so rural areas were pretty economically depressed. A lot of people were like moving to cities. And there was a lot of, it's in an atmosphere of government repression, but also like a regime that people is like clearly on the way out, which I think you can tell in the movie. I think that, viewing the movie as like a representation or a metaphor for like what Bong Joon-ho saw as the government at the time. This police force is like thoroughly incompetent. They're extremely underfunded and under-resourced, and they're like focused on results. That their goal is just to get someone that they can pin this on. And so, yeah, we can talk more. There's more like specific stuff. There's a lot of specific references in the movie too, to stuff like that.
Like, so that context is really helpful, because I went into this just like, I'm just going to watch this without doing any reading. I'm just going to watch this based on, what it is. And without that context, it was like, I wasn't able to, like, some things are falling into place now in my mind where I'm like, oh, that's actually a really smart way to do that. Like he's a genius about taking really big problems, leaving them super complicated, but just shrinking them down into his film so that people can digest and kind of grapple with them. Like Parasite does this. It's like, nominally a film about just like this small family who's struggling, who's poor, and it's sort of like rich poor divide. But then it also like comments upon like capitalism as a structure, about poverty, about like the class system in general. Like it was like a very smart movie. This movie, with that context, I'm like, oh shit, this is the exact same thing. Yeah.
And like I said, like watching it, you can watch it without that context at all, and I think it's still a very rewarding experience, but it was helpful. It's funny too, because his English language movies, to me at least, which like Okja and Snowpiercer, are both seem extremely, I think they're both great movies, but they're extremely on the nose with their metaphors. It's like very exaggerated. Like Snowpiercer, it's literally a train represents like systems of class. So it's just funny. I think his Korean movies, at least the ones I've seen, seem from my Western perspective to be subtler, but I'm like, maybe these come off as just as heavy-handed if you're actually steeped in the like context of this stuff.
Yeah, but it's sort of a cheat code a little bit to watch foreign films, to be like, wow, this is so like the story structure and everything is so interesting and new, and like all these references are like not just surface level, but like who knows if that's the case if you grow up in that culture, right?
Right.
But yeah, one thing I will say about both of these movies, if you haven't watched them already, dear listener, is that they both are pretty vivid with the violence that they depict. Like it's pretty brutal. And so it's not for everybody. Alice watched Memories of Murder and was like, I'm going to have nightmares. And then she woke up the next day and was like, I didn't sleep very well. I had nightmares.
Yeah. They both deal with, pretty terrible subject matter and terrible things. I think, Memories of Murder, isn't super. There's not a ton of violence that you see on screen, but it deals with a serial killer and someone who sexually assaults their victims. And so you deal with a lot of...
Really? Man, I would disagree. I think that there's a ton of brutality on screen. It's just from our main characters.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I'm thinking more like gore and blood.
Oh, yeah. I mean, like Lady Vengeance is, I would say, much more gore than anything else, but like Memories of Murder is pretty heavy torture. Like they hang somebody by their feet in their interrogation room just to get him to like falsely admit to a crime. Like there's like a lot of stuff in here where it's pretty brutal.
That is true.
But
Sorry.
It's just like, it's kind of weird in a way because like the serial killer is also depicted to be horrific. And you see the way that this person leaves all of these women. And it's like pretty awful in, serial killer stuff. However, that kind of degenerate sort of like thing to do is also reflected by our main characters, which is really interesting. Like I don't know if I've seen a movie where... man, we'll get into it, but like I had a really hard time empathizing with basically any of the cops. Man, they're the good guys in this movie, and it's like even set up to be like, hey, they're trying to solve a case that's like really bad, and I'm still like these fucking bozos.
I think that's kind of, to me, part of the magic of this movie is like, you have, like I said, these wholly incompetent, cruel, terrible cops, but the crimes that they are attempting to solve are so heinous, and they're clearly the only resource really in this system. You kind of are like, well, I do want them to catch the guys, but to what end? And I think that kind of, anyways, we should get into the plot and
jump in.
Can dive more into this stuff. So the movie's bookended by these two scenes, take place in the same location. It's this beautiful sun-soaked wheat field where in the first scene we see Detective Park, I believe. Song Kang-ho's character, Detective Park, is riding a tractor out to investigate a crime scene where they found a woman's body in a ditch. And immediately you get children. There's a group of children there, and they're all mocking him. He has to ride a tractor out there. He doesn't have his own car, and the children are all mocking him. I think like throughout the movie, people generally don't respect or take seriously the cops in this movie with good reason.
With good reason, yeah. These people, anyway.
But they still have, the power of being police and the the threat of, being able to use violence with impunity against them. But you're basically established of having there's two murders that they discover early on, and so they the case opens up with with them investigating this case. You're introduced to the two cops, Detective Park, who's Song Kang-ho's character. He's kind of the talker, I guess, of the two, and then the other one, Detective Cho, who is the kicker of the two. Although they both kick, everyone kicks quite a bit in this movie. But Detective Cho is kind of the enforcer. He tends to be the one that's inflicting physical violence against suspects or
also
anyone.
There's like a lot of like imagery of comparing him to an animal, essentially. Like he is not an intelligent, like he's not one of the people who puts any cases together. He literally, and he is kind of used by all of the cops in this way of like, go beat the shit out of this person or thing. Like that's basically his job.
Yeah. And so pretty shortly into it, there's been two murders, and a third detective, Detective Seo from Seoul, shows up, and he's kind of he's the foil to Detective Park. Detective Park claims he has shaman's eyes, where he can look into the eyes of a suspect and determine their guilt or innocence based on intuition. And he talks, at length about how he's focused more on folk wisdom of solving murders, whereas Detective Seo, he says early on he believes in documents. Documents don't lie. He's evidence focused, like logic focused detective. And
he's also from the big city, right? He's from Seoul.
Yeah, he's from the big city. He says he volunteered to come work on this case. And we don't really get much backstory from him, but they immediately start to clash, but they Detective Seo discovers a pattern between these murders early on, and it's hard. This movie moves fast.
It both moves fast, but also is like more than 2 hours long. So it's like a lot of stuff.
I was just trying to think of the order of events. Basically, they're
he meets with the mentally handicapped man at the
right. So
is that what happens next?
Yeah, I think there's just incredible scenes of Bong Joon-ho's so good at these long kind of like tracking shots where there's just so much kinetic action and like physical comedy happening on screen.
This is, man, I was so confused. I was watching this and I was like, is this played for comedy? Like for the first probably 30 minutes, I was like, wow, this is I guess this is funny, I didn't know. And then that slowly faded away and I was like, no, it's just horrific.
Kind of. I think it's kind of funny throughout, though. I think we could talk about some of the later scenes. I think it's generally, that's also like, very much his sensibility and Park Chan-wook's sensibility of this like genre bending, like constantly moving between stuff. And I think there's a lot of stuff. One of the first really like, one of these first kinetic scenes you get is when they're at the crime scene and it's total chaos. Like no one's in charge. No one's actually collecting evidence. There's like press there. People keep falling down this one hill, which is very funny.
That was so good.
And then there's like a footprint in the mud. A tractor comes and runs it over because he was not listening to Inspector Park. And so it's like, it's total chaos. And I think it is, a lot of it is played for comedy. But basically, there's a mentally handicapped young man in the city.
Well, can we talk quickly about the comedy at the beginning? Because I think it does two things, which I think is really interesting. One, like I said, I was like, is this a comedy? But thinking more about it, and this was something I had to sort of rock tumble for like 10 minutes with Alice, just kind of talking through it. But I think that the comedy in the beginning is also the same as the stuff that like makes you horrified later, because in comedies people are acting larger than life and kind of like eccentric and in a socially unacceptable way, but it's a comedy movie and people kind of accept it and move on, and like it's just sort of like played for laughs. It's a funny thing. This movie at the beginning I was like, oh, this is funny. I think that this might actually be like a funny movie, and I didn't know that. However, the world never treats them like they are in a comedy movie and they are not elevated, eccentric characters. They are just real people. And that makes their behavior that is funny at the beginning horrifying later on to me. And that's one of the thing that I was like, holy shit, like, wow, what a like a complete 180 on that.
Yeah. And I think there's like, they are, well, I think, for what a good example of that is the kicking. There's a lot of kicking in the movie. I think the first time it happens is when Detective Seo first shows up, and you don't know who he is in the movie. He's walking down the road. He approaches a woman, and she becomes frightened because there's been someone attacking women, and she steps off the road and kind of slides down a hill. And so he goes down and helps her, and Detective Park drives up and sees this and immediately leaps off the hill and drop kicks him in midair and like starts beating him up, not realizing that he's the other detective. And again, you have a comedy scene where they're in the car and he's like, why didn't you say anything? Which like he immediately kicked him down the hill. But I think there is a lot of comedy played early on of the contrast between the two and Detective Park's stubbornness and insistence. I think another part that's is so the third victim, basically Detective Seo determines there's been 2 victims found, and he kind of offhand mentions a third victim, and they're like, a third victim? What are you talking about? He's like, there's this woman that went missing. It matches the patterns we've seen so far. I think she was murdered. And Detective Park's like, no, I know her. She just went to Seoul. Like, she's just out of town. And Detective Seo gets support in to start looking for this body, and Detective Park isn't participating. He's just like shooting the shit with the kicking guy up on the hill, and he's like no, she just went to Seoul. And then you hear everyone start yelling. Clearly they like found something, and he's like, oh, there's a lot of like snakes down in that field. They must have found a snake. So, it's just but
did you find our main character, the detective, because throughout the film, he is confronted with the fact that he is wrong many times, or that his methods are wrong, or it's just basically like that he is not a good cop. Like that happens throughout the movie several times. And every single time he sort of does that, where he's like, oh yeah, there must be snakes down there. Like there is, like, he never internalizes any of his own mistakes or actually try to fix anything. He always just kind of like charges ahead without thinking or adapting to the situation. And I'm sort of wondering if that is like a political statement of like, if it's coming out at the end of the dictatorship and everything, that, people just, not listening to other people outside, or like, denigrating experts or something. But I wasn't quite sure why that was in the movie so prominently. Do you have any sort of insights there?
I think I read a review that that struck a chord, which is you have the 2 real main characters, Detective Park, who's the Song Kang-ho, the one you're talking about, and then Detective Seo from Seoul. And it kind of said they come from they start at the opposite ends and they end up in the same place at the end of the movie, which is basically like impotence and frustration, and inability to solve the case. And it's kind of like Detective Seo comes from the top, comes from, I don't know if it's moral standing, but just like comes from a more elevated, I guess, version of the detective, where he's very, science, logic, evidence focused. And Detective Park comes from the bottom, where he's very, emotional, instinct focused. And they ultimately, they end up in the middle, because you get the last scene, or the second to last scene of the train tunnel, where Detective Seo is so frustrated and fed up, he's ready to kill the suspect, even though they have evidence that says it wasn't him. And
honestly, his I'm so sorry. Which suspect are you talking about? Are you talking about at the very end?
The very last one, yeah.
Yeah, because like at that point, he's completely moved to be like the main character at the beginning. Like, leads with brutality, unthinking, does not accept alternate points of view, and basically, yeah, it's very interesting. Keep going. I just like
no, I just think, but you kind of get the stare down at the end with Detective Park, where he stops the other detective from shooting him. You know, they don't have the evidence that it was him, and he does the stare down ostensibly to prove his guilt, and he stops and lets him go and admits that he doesn't know, which is, I think, the first time that he does kind of admit out loud, at least,
yeah,
that he doesn't actually know. And there's this, like, I think just this uncertainty and impotence, and just like inability. There's just so much. You know, the train literally runs over. They have this piece of evidence that's from the US. Detective Park, you know, can't even read the English. It's from this unseen, unspoken lab. It's just a sheet of paper that's already getting like destroyed in the rain. Everything's just so like tenuous and fragile. And they're so just the like contradiction of the idea that this institution that they represent is supposed to actually be able to like solve anything and like serve any justice, I think just like comes to a head there. And
yeah, and it's again going back to like you know, the director's fabulous use of like thematic, like he basically wraps in everything that you could imagine into this movie. And like they have to send this test to the US, it comes back and it's inconclusive, like you said, and it just feels like, oh man, they're commenting on the US South Korean relationship and how the US is always like kind of looming over their politics and everything because of the proximity to North Korea and it being a strategic asset. But America also has never been able to come in and solve any problems.
No, you know yeah. I mean? And I mean, you can argue that America caused most of the current problems, like during the Korean War. But yeah, and I think I don't know. I think a big reason why I find this movie so good and compelling is because it's taken a real life. It's a true story. I don't think the detectives are based on anything real, but most of the murders and crimes are based on what actually happened. And it's, you know, kind of known as South Korea's first serial killer case. And at the time this movie came out, it was unsolved. It's since been solved. Someone who was arrested on a different charge admitted to the murders. But I think there's just this idea of him making this movie to look at this incredibly well-known case, and not just looking at like the facts of what happened, but like why kind of, I think the eternal question of like, why do these crimes happen? And then like, why couldn't they be solved? And like really tying it to the ineffectiveness of the regime. I think you get multiple scenes where it's clear they're more interested in beating up on student protesters than actually devoting any resources or time towards solving a case. And, you know, even the argument of like the serial killer, you know, being a result of this regime that's looking the other way. And because I'm not a huge like true crime person, I generally don't like stuff that that kind of mythologizes the serial killer. I think this movie too, I think it can be read too as like they are ascribing these patterns and stuff to the serial killer, but like in a lot of ways, like it doesn't treat the killer, I don't think, as this, for the most part, as this like you know, maniacal genius who's like outsmarting the cops. They're just sloppy and bad at their jobs. I don't even think the patterns they establish, like they don't even always follow those patterns. And I think even the guy who did it in an interview was like, yeah, I don't know why they like couldn't catch me. They literally, he's like, I talked to police multiple times during this time. They were just like, didn't think I did it. So I don't know.
They wouldn't change their opinion, which is like throughout the entire film as well.
Yeah. But so I think it just, as an entry in that, in the serial killer true crime genre, to me, it just feels like it actually has something more to say than just like a lurid retelling of the details of these cases.
Yeah.
Which I really love.
I mean, I turned to Alice at one point and I was like, I think the police are doing more damage than the serial killer.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it can be argued because, yeah, they torture multiple people, and don't they could have very well arrested and put away some of those people. And I think you kind of, we can, I mean, we don't have to go through every like plot detail, but I think, basically you get, initially they arrest, I don't even know if they arrest them, but they detain Kwang Ho, who's a mentally handicapped young man. Just basically based on him he was acquainted with one of the victims, and they detain him for a period of time. They torture him, basically doing everything they can.
That was so sad, man. That was so hard to watch.
It is, and doing everything they can to force a confession out of him so they can make arrests. And you get, both of these movies have this, and I didn't actually look it up, so I don't know if it's a Korean thing. But the thing where they reenact the crime, they bring the suspect
talk about
out.
That. Yeah, that's
to
I guess
the
that
crime.
Must be a sort of South Korean thing.
And it's like treated in both movies as like a way to validate their guilt to the public, which is super fascinating. Like they have to get all the details right. And that's kind of where it all goes wrong with this, where his dad shows up and he starts screaming that he's innocent, and it turns into this whole media fiasco that ends up blown up in their face. And again, but they really don't face any consequences for it, other than they shuffle up the bureaucrats in their department and bring in a new chief, and then just continue on as they were.
Yeah.
But so they, essentially they, just trying to see plot stuff. You kind of just, the movie progresses through of them doing some extent of detective work. Detective Seo is basically Detective Seo is getting some stuff right, and then the female detective in the department
who they completely ignore and sideline.
But she's probably the most right one of the movie. I feel like she actually probably does the most actual detective work, at least.
She actually has some insights.
Least damage. But they're kind of starting to develop this profile and patterns of the killer, that he attacks women in red, which doesn't always end up being true. He attacks when it's raining, and they discover there's this one song that's playing on the radio
every time it rains.
When he attacks. I think some of the comedy too is like Detective Park trying to do detective work, because he watches a lot of these detective shows and he sees Detective Seo, but his detective work is like, well, there wasn't any pubic hair at the crime scene, so the suspect must be hairless, and so he like goes to a bathhouse to like inspect everyone there.
See, this is a thing that I think may have been me, is that hearing it back now, I'm like, that's objectively very good satire and silly. However, when I was watching it, I was just like, this motherfucker. Like, I was just so mad and angry at him that I couldn't process it as comedy.
That's fair. That's fair. I think for me, I like, it's one of those cases where I like him so much as a performer.
Yeah, he's so great. What a performance, I gotta say.
Yeah, I just find him extremely compelling and very good at that kind of comedy. So even though I know his character is a terrible person, I'm like, I'm still enjoying the performance of it.
Yeah.
But he he basically gets, I think this is kind of some of the other comedy I think comes in. So his girlfriend recommends he go to a shaman to ask about the case. And he goes to the shaman, and she's basically like, I'm going to sell you this kit that's going to show you the face of the killer. No pictures. She's going to sell him this kit. And you get him saying, she starts to pull out this thing, and he says like, I'm not buying anything from you. And then it's immediate hard cut to them out in the field, like doing the thing. And I think there's multiple scenes of that too, of different characters being like, that's stupid, I'm not going to do that. And then it immediately cuts like wordlessly to them doing it. Mm-hmm. But this is one of my favorite scenes in the movie, is you get, him and the other detective are there doing this ritual that's supposedly going to show them the face of the killer. And then they hear someone coming. It's Detective Seo. So they go hide in the bushes. Detective Seo is also, at this point, he's seeming to kind of try to like divine inspiration. He's listening to the song on the radio, like visiting the crime scene.
He's kind of being like a classic TV policeman. where he's like, I'm going to put myself into the mind of the killer and I'm going to like retrace their steps and figure it out. But like you said, it is kind of divination in another way. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And then someone else shows up. And so then he goes and hides on the other side and it's someone coming to masturbate on women's underwear at the crime scene.
Mm-hmm.
And so they are, ostensibly thinking they're going to catch the guy. They
always return to the scene of the crime. That was
right.
Part of
again, it's following these tropes, and they make a noise and they let themselves be known. And then you get this really, again, I think just visually, I just love like watching this movie. Even these scenes where nothing good comes of it. You get this like really thrilling chase scene. And it's like, I feel bad saying this because they are terrible people, but I'm like, it's just cool. It looks cool when they all jump over the little chain fence together and they're all running together. And the music's playing. I'm like, man, this is good. This is good shit. But basically I think this too, you get a good scene because they chase this guy. They end up at the quarry where he blends in with all the workers. And so they're all scrambling to try to find him. And Detective Park sees he was wearing red underwear under his pants. Detective Park sees the underwear, so he's doing actual detective work. He sees the evidence, but he pretends. He gets them to all line up and then looks in their eyes and pretends that he's doing his eye trick.
Yeah.
And I think
his reputation is so important to him as well.
Yeah. But it's so unfounded. Like no one believes him that he can do the eye thing. Like none of the other cops he works with, the chief, like no one actually, he's the only one that believes it. Yeah. I don't even know if he believes it either. I think he just wants it to be true.
There's a couple of points in the movie where I'm like, is he so delusional that he can't see it? Or is this like him lying to all these people because he's trying to keep up a facade? Because there's that scene with his wife like halfway through the movie or something. I think it's actually after, maybe before this or after it, where they're laying in bed and she's like, is that new cop still giving you like so much trouble? And he's like, yeah. He's like, you won't believe all this shit he's putting me through, when the other cop is like trying to do like actual detective work. And then she's like, you know what? You should go see the shaman. It was before the shaman. She's like, yeah, you should go see the shaman. And so it was like, so like maybe they are so like in this other mindset that they don't see it, or maybe it's delusional. I can't really tell.
Yeah, I think it's too just like him. He's kind of the king of his own world and has been able to do things his own way too. Yeah. And so it's just like someone coming in and shaking things up.
Oh my God. What you just said, just like, again, this man, everyone was like, wow, Parasite's amazing. This director, every single one of his movies are really interesting when it comes to thematic stuff. And I just realized that at the end, when because towards the end, and we'll get there, but it cuts forward to 2003 when the film was released. And the cop is now sort of a salesman, and he's left the profession. And I just realized that the way that he is treating his family and the way that he is on the phone with like his superiors then is also sort of like him being the king of his own world and like treating people badly. And he's like kind of still doing it. And I bet it's the director saying like, yeah, the dictatorship is over and all of this crap is gone, but now it's just built into the capitalist sort of hellscape that South Korea has turned itself into under democracy, so it like looks different. He looks more respectable. He's, a salesman now. He's wearing a suit, but he's still the same guy, and he's still kind of doing the same things, just in a different way. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, absolutely.
And it took you saying that to kind of bring that up in me, but I was like, wow, he's still doing the same exact stuff.
Yeah, because he tries to do the thing. I mean, I think it's kind of played for a joke too about this son. He's like, did you stay up late playing video games all day? And the son's like, no, I didn't. And he's like, look at me in the eyes, like I can tell that you're lying. So he is still trying to like exert this power that he once had. And it is kind of like an impotent power though, because he's just like selling juicers. Yeah. But yeah, so you basically they end up arresting or detaining again this man who's seemingly only guilty of the crime jerking off, which he asks. He says, is jerking off a crime? And the answer is no, but they hold him, and then you start to get protests because he's a church going man. He takes care of his sick wife. And so it's kind of a repeat of the playbook they used with Kwang Ho, where they're holding him and torturing him to the point where he gives a confession, and and
it's so strange too, because they've been torturing him, and there's a scene where one of the cops comes in and they're sitting with the tape recorder, and they're like, okay, then what happened? And he's like, well, in my dream this happened, and they turn the tape recorder off, and they're like, are you still doing this in my dream shit? Like, why don't we get a good take, okay? Or else I'm going to have him come and beat the shit out of you again. And it's like, oh my God, like they can't. And that goes back to that question is like, are they delusional or do they just not care? You know, because they're obviously like hearing these people give accounts that are like not confessions, but they keep just trying to twist it into one. And again, like in my reading of the film, I was never able to pin down whether or not it's because they think that they actually are right and this is the way you do things, even though it's frustrating and stupid. Or is it that they know that it's not right, but they just need to get the result as fast as possible and they don't care if it's the real killer or not? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's probably a little bit of both, but I think of it as the latter too. Like the goal is to get their picture in the newspaper of them all giving the thumbs up and like, we got the guy. And it doesn't matter to them if it's actually the guy or not. They can just say, we got the guy. But yeah, essentially they're holding this guy. I think it's interesting too that like theoretically Detective Seo is kind of the more moralistic one of doing things the right way, but he also like doesn't intervene really. He kind of just ignores whenever they're like detaining and torturing these people. Like a lot of times he's just in the background.
Which made me be like, okay, I can't be like, oh, this is the good guy or whatever, because he's also a party to all this and doesn't try to stop anything.
Right. Yeah. He just he kind of tries to do his own work in the background while this is all going on. And there's a lot of stuff, a lot of the evidence they find isn't because of like good police work. It's just like an accident. So even here, like the next development you get is he's talking about this idea of someone coming up out of the outhouses behind this school. It's kind of this urban legend that they've heard.
Mysticism.
Yeah. And this is something that they had heard before from these two schoolgirls that they kind of ignored again as just like an urban legend, but he's heard it the second time. So he's like, what, you know, where did you hear this? What's the origin of this? And so he goes to the school, presumably to investigate this. This is also, again, I think where you get one of those comedic scenes where he's like, I don't have time to go out and like look around an outhouse. And then it immediately cuts to him looking around the outhouse. Yeah. And he startles a woman in there, you know, she thinks he's a creep, but he ends up talking to her. And I think there's reference to people hearing a woman crying. And it turns out there's a woman that lives up on the hill. And he goes and again, he goes and tries to speak to her. She doesn't want to talk. And so he has their female colleague come talk to her and interview her for her story. And it turns out that she was assaulted by the killer and is able to give more information about his physical description. She says his hands were soft. And so he
because she was actually a victim, right? He's like the one that got away essentially.
Yes. Yeah. And so eventually they have to really, I mean, it is kind of funny because after all this time torturing and holding this guy, he goes back and I think you're supposed to think that Detective Seo kind of believes that the eye thing worked when they were at the quarry. And like, it's not until he has the evidence to prove otherwise of the handsoft thing that he because then at that point he's like, you have to let him go, which is kind of funny because you're like, you didn't have any evidence before this to prove that he did it other than that he showed up at the scene of the crime and was being a pervert about it. But it's not until like that happens that he's like, you have to go. I think too, he's like so singularly focused on the case and like solving the case. He's not, he doesn't really seem to care too much about the people that are like collateral damage in the way. I think Or yeah,
So
go
I'm
ahead.
so sorry. I was just gonna say the can we talk a little bit about the gender politics in this as well? Because I think that that's exactly right, that they are not thinking about other people, but also it's sort of a commentary, or it feels like a commentary on like the societal like sidelining of women. Because you talked about the detective who is a woman who they all just don't listen to, even though she keeps coming up with these pretty interesting lines of inquiry or like things that she notices. The woman who escaped from the killer is like terrified of the cops, and they don't really ever try to comfort her or anything or try to give her protection. They're just like trying to extract what they can out of her in sort of like the fastest way possible. All of the women who get killed are sort of like, a couple of them are actually characters that are we see outside of this as well, and they are never protected. The police never even do a thing where they're like, do not go outside at night till we solve this. Like there's like a bunch of things where they just like don't really care about women.
Yeah, there's very little
Yeah.
attempt to like prevent it too, especially in like an area where it seems like there's a lot of like pedestrians in areas of the town that are pretty like remote and uninhabited, that people frequently, because a lot of times, yeah, it's someone walking to or from work, like to or from school. I think in one case it is like a social, she seems to be meeting up with someone outside the
Mm-hmm.
factory. But yeah, it is this like, there is, I think the only time there's seemingly an attempt to protect, and even then it's probably more an attempt to catch the killer, is like the next part where they get into this big fight. He tells them to let the guy go. The two detectives get in this big fight, and then the female detective shouts stop and turns up the radio, and the song's playing on the radio,
Mm-hmm.
and then he runs. I just, again, like, even though we know, I think that's the thing of this movie, even though these are like terrible, all the people trying to solve this are terrible, there's still this awful thing happening of people getting killed.
Yeah.
So anytime they get close to like solving it or stopping it, you want them so bad to do it, because they run to the window. The way this it's like a song on the radio and him running to the window and putting his hand outside and like the music cue, and you're like,
Yeah.
shit, it's going to happen again. And that's the chief calls the military, and they're basically like, he's like, I need you to send
anyone here.
yeah, I need you to send a battalion here. Basically, we need to, be ready for this. And they're like, oh, sorry, we're busting up student protests in the city. There's literally no one we can send you.
Yeah. And also the interesting thing too is that Bong Joon-ho also does this throughout the movie, where he will take a character, a female character, and he will show you their life as it starts to rain, and show them either making a decision to go out or whatever. And he does it like 3 times with characters that like he does it with the main cop's wife once. He does it with the lady cop once, and he does it, and the last one, something bad happens to the person. She actually does get grabbed. But it I thought it was just so well done, because it's like these detectives are treating it like this is not related to them. They're just trying to catch it because, like you said, it's like sort of a PR thing, and they're trying to prove their worth and all that kind of thing. They're trying to dispel this idea that they're impotent. However, all of the people that are close to them, who are women, keep being almost killed, but it's just sort of like random circumstance that they don't. Like the main cop's wife almost goes out in a red shawl, sees that it's starting to rain, and is like, and then like takes off the shawl and leaves it in the house. And it's like, man, this is like yeah. Anyway, I don't really have more to say than that, but it's just sort of like this moment of, so it is like crazy frustrating to watch, because you're like, these are people that are directly in your life, and you're not doing anything to stop it.
Right. And this like, there's precarity, excuse me, precarity and just like pure circumstance that, because I think the killer too is really never that, is always kind of portrayed as this like looming presence. I read too, I think it's similar to Zodiac, which is a movie this movie's compared to a lot. Yeah. Where in any scene featuring the killer, like they use in this movie, you barely see much of them, but they use different actors to kind of throw you off the scent. Because as an audience member, we're also never supposed to be certain, which I think really makes the ending really effective. And they do that. I know they do that in Zodiac too, with each like killing scene. It's different actors based on the descriptions that were given. But from this murder, you get the song plays. They're able to get the postcard from the radio station of who sent it, and they track down this guy. It's Park Hyung-gu, and they bring him in. And
who's this like sort of young, handsome? Does he work at the gypsum mine?
He works at the factory, but he works in the office, so his hands would be smooth.
Mm-hmm.
And he is so smooth and blank.
Yeah,
which I think
not emotional at all throughout the entirety of his detainment,
and somewhat defiant of the police. But you're like, is this because you're guilty, or is this because you hate cops and know that they suck? Like,
well, I mean, like he's not the only one either who, like, a couple of the people that they bring in and detain are like, oh, you guys torture people here, right? Are you going to torture me? Like,
right. Yeah.
That happened several times in the movie. And he says that. He's like, I know you guys just bring random people in and torture them. Like, I'm with it enough to know that it's not going to work on me. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And so he's like, yeah, he's not cooperative with them. He's defiant. And this is, I think, where you get the scene that's from the Every Frame a Painting thing of the interrogation scene, where it's just framed so well of having all of the characters in the frame.
If we're going to stop for a second and talk about framing, holy shit, this movie is amazing. Like, from, just like really open, wide shots of like the field and all of the stuff swaying. And like what he does with depth is so cool. Like a detective or something. Like there's one scene where a woman is walking and then a head pops out of the rice paddies or whatever it is that's on the side of the roads. And you see just like this shape kind of come up and then like go back down under the thing, and it's so fucking scary. And then there's another one where they're all talking. It's when the female cop who is like turns on the radio is like, listen, they are structured in a way so that at the closest to us is our main character, and he's sort of like feet up on the desk, like whatever, blah, blah, blah. Mid-ground, we have the chief of police, who's like the moral heart and trying to be like, we have to find this killer, everybody, even though he's also super problematic. And then at the far ground, furthest away from us, is the cop from Seoul, who is like trying to get like a new type of police work to be happening for this case. And just the way that they framed it, and then she like comes in from the side, it's just like super visually appealing and really creative. I thought that was super cool.
Yeah, there's so much. It's just incredible. Yeah, the movie feels like choreographed to an incredible degree. And it's interesting to know like how much of that stuff is explicitly choreographed and blocked out, or if they're able to just like by focusing on doing these longer takes, they're able to just kind of like construct these like really great scene pictures that like say a lot without having to say anything. But you get to this point where Detective Seo's convinced that Park Hyung-gu did it, basically, and now he's ready to beat him up to try to get a confession. Basically, he's getting extremely frustrated, but they're like, there's kind of this understanding in the group that like we need to do it right this time because this might actually be the guy. We can't fuck this up like we did before. But the kick happy detective just gets too. His emotions get the best of him. He loses his shit. He kicks him and the lights go out. And so they're kind of like, you idiot, you fucked up. That's when the chief pushes him down the stairs too.
That was brutal too. Like, man. And this was like, and he actually says at this part, he's like, you're just like a dog. You're like a wolf, like a rabid wolf or whatever. And he kicks him down the stairs and he's like not moving. He's just sort of like twitching at the bottom of the stairs. It's pretty visceral.
Yeah. And so you get, I think you kind of, after that, you get this, they eventually come to this realization. They're, extremely frustrated, but they come to this realization that Kwang Ho, the mentally disabled man who they tortured, he actually knew a lot of really specific details about the case.
And if you actually listen to the tape at the beginning, when he's like, they're trying to get a fake confession out of him, what he's saying is actually what he saw, because he followed this woman when she was killed and he saw it all. So they have the witness, like they have
literally from the start. Yeah. They had the witness, but and so they try to go find him at the restaurant, and you get this simultaneous scene where the kicking detective he's ashamed and pissed off about what happened. And so he's gotten really drunk, and there's a news story playing, and I looked it up because they're talking about this Detective Moon. It's a real case they're talking about on the news of this detective who tortured and sexually assaulted student protesters, I think in Seoul. And so the people in the restaurant are commenting, like, I think all detectives, I think they even say maybe like, all detectives should be castrated or something.
Yeah, they do say that.
And so
it's a very ACAB moment, but way before its time.
Yeah, because I think, there's just this sentiment, especially among young people, I think, in the country who are in college or just paying attention. I mean, even when the one scene, the president comes to visit and there's mass protests, even in this small rural area.
Yeah.
And so he starts a fight in there. Eventually Kwang Ho shows up, tries to break up the fight and hits him with a chair leg and sends a nail into his leg, which is pretty gnarly. And then he runs off, and they're trying to chase him.
And I should also say, like, the breaking up of the fight is one reading, and that's definitely in there. But he's also, like, you have to remember, was tortured by these people. And so he's acting from a way of like, I'm not going to let you torture people. It's like, wow, a good guy. Finally, we have somebody who's trying to do the right thing. And he's the mentally handicapped person they abused at the beginning.
Right. And so now, too, they run into this thing where, now that they need him, he's scared for his life. He thinks that they're going to torture him and kill him. And so he doesn't want to cooperate.
And he runs away from them. And like, there's a couple of really great moments in this sequence where there's obviously the chair leg part, right? And then there's also the part where he climbs that like telephone pole thing, and he's up there, and that's when they realize that he saw the killer, and he admits it. And then there's that other great scene where he like tries to run away from them again and ends up on the train tracks, which is like the next big beat. But like all three of those things just are like really, like, the pacing is pretty beautiful, and it's like so tense the entire time.
And you gotta kind of get this this like mirroring of the scene at the beginning of Detective Park trying to yell at the tractor not to run over the footprint, but he's trying to yell at him not to get off the train tracks because the train's coming. He can't stop it, and he gets hit by the train, and then Detective Park literally has blood on his hands after this. But basically I think after this they find a semen sample on one of the victims. But they have to send it to the US. They don't have a lab in Korea, which I think, again, as he talked about, this like dependence on the US and this kind of just like distant connection, any resources that they would actually need are these kind of like far, abstract, distant things. The detective, his leg becomes infected. He gets it amputated. You get the scene of him looking at the other detective looking at his empty boots. I think very symbolic of the kind of impotence of it all. But now they're tailing this Park Hyung-gu, who they think did it. The detective tailing him literally falls asleep in his car, and his car won't start to follow him, and they lose sight of him. And he goes on the bus. He doesn't come home. And there's also a military drill, like a blackout military drill.
Yeah.
And so, again, basically, you're at this point where they know when the murders are going to happen, and they can't do anything to stop it. Or theoretically catch the guy. And then this is where it also gets really personal with Detective Seo, because he goes to the crime scene in the rain, and it's this young girl who he'd spoken to at the school and had helped put a Band-Aid on her. And you get this thing where you're probably going to say the same thing I was about to, where it's like this really interesting scene where when he met her at the school, she has she basically got like a splinter or something, and she's bleeding a little bit on her side. And so he takes a Band-Aid and goes to stick it on her. And she's like, no, I don't like anyone to see like my stomach or whatever. And he's like, I'm a cop. Like, I'm just going to put this on. It's fine. And so she like lifts up her shirt, and he puts the Band-Aid on. And then it's mirrored from here where she's now dead. And you see them take the Band-Aid off. And the Detective Seo is like looking at it, and he kind of freaks out, and he just like pulls all of her clothes like down so it's covering her again, because she didn't want anyone to see her side. And I found that was like the most human moment
that any of the cops actually show throughout the entire movie. Like
think
this
so,
was something
yeah.
where he finally is like caring about the individuals in the case rather than the case as a whole. Did you get any of that? Like, did you feel anything there? Or
I think so, yeah, because that's really like the point that breaks him, because he doesn't really have
Yeah.
any connection to anyone in this town. He's coming from
Yeah.
out of town. You have some of a human connection between the other detective and his girlfriend or wife, but even that's a very like transactional relationship because she's a nurse and just kind of like nurses takes care of him mostly.
Yeah.
Most of what you see their interactions. So yeah, I think that does represent this like human connection he's made with a person in the town, and it's a literal child. Like he feels a sense of like duty to protect, and he couldn't protect this person. And so yeah, I think that's kind of like truly what breaks him, because then he goes and gets Park Hyung-gu, takes him out to this beautiful long dark tunnel in the rain and is ready to assassinate him on there. And there's some very convenient plotting. Or go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was going to say, which is exactly what you said at the beginning when we started talking about it, where it's like this shift where Detective Seo, who came from Seoul and was trying to do things by the books, was trying to do stuff like very evidence-based, collect evidence. He becomes essentially a vigilante, which is where the other detectives start the movie at. And I'm so sorry. What is the name of the detective who has like the shaman eyes? What's his name?
Oh, Park. Detective Park.
Park. So Park has the opposite journey in this moment, and it's like you said before, it's very interesting. This is the scene where they meet in the middle and everybody is left unsatisfied.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, because he's about to kill him, and basically the guy again, he's like, I killed them all. Is that what you want me to say? Like, what do you want from this interaction? And Detective Park comes running up in the rain with the results, gives them to Detective Seo. He reads them. It says they're inconclusive, basically. They can't prove that the DNA came from him, because I think it's again too this like impotence of like, is this saying that it wasn't him, or is it just inconclusive? It's coming from this point. Like, there's no way. They're like, we just sent the samples back. There's no follow up or like any opportunity for them there. And then it literally gets run over by the train. Yeah. And like, like you said, they've totally like switched places. He literally says the document is a lie, which is like contradicts his earlier statement where he's like, documents never lie. He's like, no, that document's a lie. I know in my gut it was him. He's ready to kill him. And then there's the eye contact scene where Detective Park is like, let me do my thing, which is funny because you're like, I guess he does believe that he can actually do it. Yeah. See the guilt in people. But then he's not convinced. He's like, I honestly don't know.
Which is so interesting because he was so sure with people who weren't the killer. And now you have this person who is their best bet at who the killer is. And he's like, I don't know. And he like can't do it. Right. And so it's like, I wonder I feel like it is obviously something that is being said. I just haven't quite parsed out what it means yet. But and the guy just like, he lets him go and he runs off down the tunnel into the darkness, and you never see him again, essentially. Yeah.
Until you get this train. A train comes, this big unstoppable force out of the long dark tunnel. And he does pick up the gun and try to shoot at him because he falls down, and you're like, oh, did he get him? And he gets up and then walks into this long dark tunnel. Yeah. And then, if from there it's fade to black, 2003. You're back in
the guy doing the juicer thing.
Yeah. And it's crazy because it's like they make him look a little older, but you're like, he's still the same person. Yeah. But
they make him like a little thinner or something. Like they've done something to shape his face differently. And maybe it was just the uniform he was wearing before, and then the suit later just is more flattering. But like he's very much the same, but he looks like just a different version of himself. It's like when you're playing a video game and you just get a different like character skin to put on the main character or whatever.
Yeah, definitely. Because he is just, it's interesting too. I mean, you don't see a lot, but you get the sense that it's a completely different world, or at least a completely different world that he's living in.
it's more modern. They have like a house.
Yeah.
He has a family. It seems like a little bit more sort of like he is still trying to exercise authority in a kind of gross way, but he is doing it as a father rather than as a public figure.
It's more modern and more Western too. But then, yeah, he's out on this sales call and realizes, like, geographically, he's still extremely close to this place because he's out on the sales call and realizes he's driving by this field and it's like, hey, stop here. Gets out, goes and peers into the ditch again. It looks a lot like the tunnel from the last scene. And this little girl shows up and she's like, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm just looking at this tunnel. She's like, that's funny. There's a man. She says something vague, like there's a man not long ago doing the same thing.
And he's like, what, who was it? What did he look like?
Yeah. She was like, it was kind of ordinary.
And then it's just spike the camera, slow zoom in on Detective Park's face as he's just like, oh, you can't tell. Everyone looks, ordinary.
There's just like, they'll never know. There's just, this endless uncertainty. And he looks into the camera with like tears in his eyes, this kind of just like both peering. I think the idea initially was like he's looking into the audience because at the time the crime was unsolved. And there's this idea that like the killer could be watching this movie. It could be anyone out there in the public. And I think now, this is this other like review I read too, kind of, now that the case has been solved and you know that there was someone out there. The guy apparently too is like, yeah, I watched the movie. I didn't really think much of it. It was just a movie to me. You're like, oh God. But it is just almost like pleading look with the audience of just like, I don't know, just kind of like resignation of just like, this is the kind of
a final admission of, oh, I don't have some sort of power to change this. You know what I mean?
And like what the hell am I supposed to do? And then that's it. Roll credits. Again, you get beautiful shots of the fields as the credits roll. I just love the grass blowing in the wind. It's so nice.
It's beautiful, man. It's a very beautiful movie. Though Alice was talking about the color tone of this movie is very exposed. Like the lighting on it kind of washes a lot of it out. And I think that the why for like the reason why I was like, wow, I kind of like that is it made everything feel a little bit more dark and gritty, but it also made it feel like you were shooting it out of a DSLR or like a camera that anybody can kind of pick up at the store. So it made it feel almost like this is just like life. Right. And so with the shots and everything, they don't look very like cinema. They look more like this is footage of like these people in their normal lives, which I thought was really effective. I liked it.
Yeah. I think the bulk of the movie is pretty washed out in gray intentionally. It's almost never sunny, raining a lot. And then the two bookend scenes are both sunny, like golden, completely different from the rest of the movie. Kind of like stand as this like separate thing. I mean, I think you kind of have the start of like, it's before any of this has happened. So there's this kind of maybe like more golden hue. And then the end is kind of like, we've left this all behind, but he returns to it. And it's like, oh no, it's all still there. I'm still,
you've
powerless.
Papered over it but it's still kind of rotten underneath kind of thing.
Yeah. So like powerless.
Which is a good societal commentary.
Hey, yeah. But I think, I don't know, to me is to sum this up, this is one of those movies that I know the content is horrible, the characters are bad people, but this movie is just like endlessly watchable to me and is a weird I watched it this time like in fits and starts a little bit just to watch it before this. I didn't really have time to sit down and watch it all together. But I think every time I was just like right back in it as soon as I started watching.
For me, like it's because I have been sick for the last like 3 days and have just been feeling a little low energy and a little like, ugh. But this was a really hard watch. It was like you said, and I made a Letterboxd review where I was like essentially 2.5, which I know is low. It's a fantastic movie. It literally like I can watch this movie and be like, this cinematography, amazing. What he's trying to do, amazing. The thematic tie-ins and like the social commentary, very potent. It was just a really hard watch for me. It was really brutal, and it was just like, oh man, I hate these people. And so like, yeah, I had a rough time, but I also was like, it's one of those movies I'm going to be thinking about for a while, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I would watch it again, but I think I would watch it again with you, where we could just like sit down and we could like kind of go through it together, because watching it with Alice was just like, this is horrific. And I was like, yes, it is.
Yeah. And I think that's fair. I mean, I don't begrudge anyone for watching it and being like, I can't. The protagonists of this movie are all corrupt, bad people, and it's a bad time. I don't know why. We should talk about Lady Vengeance, because I think the content of Lady Vengeance is a movie I also really like.
Yeah.
But is like, I think the content of that movie is harder for me.
Interesting. I found it so much easier.
And I think I've seen that one twice now, and I'm like, I think I'm good. I don't feel the need to like watch that again. But Memories of Murder, I think put on and watch repeatedly. But I don't know.
Wow, this is fascinating, because I feel maybe the opposite of you when it comes to that, where I'm like, man, I feel like I could watch Memories of Murder one more time to get a little bit more out of it and do a little bit more close reading. Lady Vengeance, I feel as though is like a much more personal story, and it's a much more character driven story. And I found myself just able to kind of fall into it a little bit more. Also, something that I don't know if you felt when you watched it, but like for me, it feels like two separate movies that are kind of slapped together thematically or like tone wise.
Yeah.
And the version that we watched for the listener, so it's on Tubi right now, but there are two versions of this movie. One is where it stays in color the entire way through. And then a version where throughout the movie, it slowly fades to black and white grayscale. And I loved that. I loved the black and white version. I couldn't imagine it any other way. It was just like so good.
I watched that one first. Yeah. And then this time I watched the full color version. I think I prefer the fade because it also highlights that kind of dichotomy that you're talking about, where it feels like two different movies.
Right. So why don't we just start out? I'll try to get the plot out of the way pretty quick. And then we can kind of talk specifically about the movie, because man, there's a lot to talk about. So Lady Vengeance was directed by Park Chan-wook, and it was released in 2005. It's part of the Revenge trilogy. They're not really like directly attached to each other. They're just like on the same theme. It's Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, Old Boy, and then Lady Vengeance. And it's just the director really kind of like thinking about revenge and vengeance and sort of seeing it in all of its different forms, which made me honestly want to watch Old Boy and the other one after this. I was like, oh man, these are interesting. I want to see more. But the plot is that our main character, Lee Gem-ja, is in prison and has been in prison for killing a little boy, and she's been in there for 13 years, and she's being released early. So maybe not 13 years, but she's getting released a little bit early because she has converted to Christianity in prison. She's become sort of like this angelic figure. Like there's this really interesting thing that they do where in the first maybe 20 minutes of the movie, there are certain scenes where other people are talking about her, and it will cut to her and her face is glowing like Jesus. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
It's like so weird. It's an effect that you would never see in an American movie, which made it a little jarring.
Yeah, no, there's Park Chan-wook, has crazy, bold, stylistic choices. And there's a lot in this movie too that I think are great. I love it.
Yeah, and like the colors right away, it's like really like jewel tones, a lot of jewel tones, very deep greens and reds, and even though the walls aren't just white, they're sort of tan, and it's just like very visually compelling. And she comes out, and she's supposed to be this like sort of Buddha-like figure of generosity and repentance, and the priest who converted her and has like basically made her his project is meeting her as she comes out with this band who are all playing. They're dressed up like Santa, and they're kind of like singing for her as she comes out to congratulate her for being released. And he gives her a block of tofu, which is sort of symbolic and is in South Korea is sort of like you give to prisoners to say like you are white like this tofu, you are pure and clean, and you have done your time essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And she just knocks it out of his hands and says essentially like, go fuck off. And puts on some dope shades and walks out. And you're like, whoa, this person seems very different than all of the lead up for, because like you've been told so much about this character for the first 15 minutes. And the first thing she does is go against all of that, which I think was really a really cool character introduction.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much packed in this movie. The crazy, like you said, it basically tells a whole revenge story plot in the first hour.
Yeah.
And it packs in a lot into that. And one detail that I just love, because it's a specific choice, so you're not really clear why, is the priest has this insane Lord Farquaad haircut.
Yeah, it's
and
horrible.
You get a flashback when she first meets him, and he has a normal haircut then. So you're like, is this haircut somehow tied to his like devotion to Gomja? Like, I love it though.
It's very strange. He does have sort of the Prince Valiant kind of thing going on.
Yes, very much.
And maybe it's because it's supposed to be this figure of redemption and be like, I have shepherded you through this, and then her rejection of that, because he gets really upset, and like later in the movie, it kind of fucks things up and like comes back into the movie a couple of times. Yeah. But maybe they were commenting on that. Not entirely sure. But she gets out. She leaves, and it becomes very apparent very quickly that all of like the kind-hearted things that she did in prison were all to sort of like make all of the women that were in the cell with her owe her a favor or like her in such a way that they would do something for her. And it is, like you said, it is revealed that she has a revenge plot that she has been plotting for the last like 10 years to get back at this guy. And it's not quite sure why that's happening at first. And then you kind of get told later on, this guy actually, did he impregnate her, or was she just pregnant outside of that and then goes to him for help?
That isn't totally clear. I went back and forth. I almost felt like based on that phone conversation she has, she maybe got pregnant from another student, but I'm not clear, because she talks to him on the phone and she's like, hey, you were my teacher and you said that I was sexy. Can I come live with you because I'm pregnant? And then she says something like, he can't be a father. He's too immature. So which makes me think that maybe another student got her pregnant. And so before making this call, I don't know if she'd actually had a like sexual relationship with him, or if he was just a creepy teacher and she was a literal child. But yeah, anyways, that was how I read it, but I'm not positive that that's what it is.
Yeah, no, I think you might be right. And because the teacher's also like, go to your mom, go to your dad. And she's like, no, I can't go to either of those people, which is really sad. But it is revealed that he has her come live with him, kind of like abuses her. But the main thing he does is that he kidnaps, once she has her baby, he has her like kidnap this kid, because he's like, this is the way I make money. And if you're going to live with me, you're going to have to do this. Don't worry. There's good kidnappings and bad kidnappings. The good kidnappings are great because we get the money, we return them. They're closer as a family. Everything's perfect. And so she kidnaps this main character, the sort of character that she went to prison for. And he kills this kid. And then has her child and says, you got to take the fall for me or I'm going to kill your kid. And so that's why she goes to prison. You find this out kind of over the course of the whole movie, but I just wanted to kind of put that out there so that people aren't confused as we talk through this.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. But yeah, so then this part of the movie almost felt like Ocean's 11 to me, because it is her going to each one of the prisoners that she served with and being like, hey, you owe me. And then it kind of cuts back to them and it has them entering the cell for the first time, their name, and then how long that they served in prison. And then you sort of see the situation they're in, and then you see how she kind of comes in and helps them or saves them or does something for them that allows them to basically owe her, but also indebts them to her in a way, both emotional and, favor wise.
Yeah. And it's again, it's like this really inventive storytelling where he sets up that device early on, and then later on it kind of pays off in this cool way of like revealing the plot. When you learn that the teacher's wife or girlfriend is also one of the prisoners, you kind of get that.
And so you're like, oh shit, like this plan was pretty in depth. Like this person literally married or is in a relationship with this killer for the main character, which I think is great. Very cool. But yeah, so she kind of goes through stuff. One of the things I think is really interesting about this movie is that the first thing any character says to her when she meets them outside of prison, or like basically visits them when she gets out of prison, they're all like, oh, you've changed. Mm-hmm. Like this was an act.
Yeah. They're like, yeah, you're so different. There's a ton of Christianity, rebirth, redemption theming in this movie,
but also sort of like my take on it was sort of a rejection of that, because I feel like she acts super pious and prays all the time to get out of prison or whatever. But then there's this pretty funny moment a little later where she's going into her house, but she's planning on doing some things for her plan. And the priest comes back again and is like, why did you just come back to church with me? And like basically massages her face, and she's takes out a book and goes, I've converted to Buddhism. Which I think is just so great.
Too, it's the book that the gun blueprints were in, that the old woman who defected from North Korea that was in prison gave her, which I think is really cool. Yeah, I think it's interesting because she does reject Christianity, but she's definitely seeking redemption and rebirth.
Oh, for sure.
For herself through vengeance. And I think at the end, it's obviously a struggle of posing the question of what can you really find that in vengeance?
Yeah. I really want to talk about that when we get there, because I agree. I think that's something that we should really discuss. And then also we can talk a little bit about what Tony Zhao has to say about that kind of thing. But yeah, so she starts going to different people. You meet all of these characters. Each of them are so interesting and good that I was super entertained for the first half, where she meets, this woman who she basically was a lover to in prison, and they get out and she's like, you never loved me, did you? And she's like, sorry. And then there's another person who went in prison because her and her husband were robbing a bank. And she was going to die without being able to see her husband again, because in prison, it turned out her kidney was failing. And our main character gives her one of her kidneys so that she survives. And then when you get out, maybe my favorite characters, they're super unrepentant. They're like, yeah, this fucking rocks. When we went and tried to rob that bank, that's when I knew I loved her. That kind of stuff. But then she's like, can you make me this gun? And they are like, yes, we can. I
love that couple, and the scene where she's like, I thought I was in agony because I miss my husband so much. Turns out I just had kidney failure.
Yeah,
which is really fun.
And it was really interesting too, because when you see them talking to each other outside of prison, they're still very much in love, and the wife is like, oh, maybe next time we can be in prison together. And he goes, well, that wouldn't be punishment. that would be paradise.
Yes. I love that.
Yeah, they're great. What a wonderful little sidebar with them. But they start making her a gun, like this really interesting, like manual kind of like contraption that doesn't shoot very far. But if you get close, which is very thematic, where you have to essentially be able to see the sweat on their brow. It's like very, very clear that you have to be, they're like, you need to be able to smell them. You need to be able to see the sweat on their head. If you don't, then don't shoot because you're not going to hit them, which is very, very cool for later. But she does that. She meets another person in prison who was essentially, I think this is the one who eventually dates the killer. But she was thrown in prison for stealing something and is sexually assaulted by one of the other inmates who is in there. Who, man, I want to talk to you about that character because I'm not sure how I feel about it. She's this character who's in prison because she ate her husband and his lover when she found them together.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of like a weird, and she's like definitely the biggest actress in the movie. And I was sort of like, I don't know how I feel about this, but also she's repulsive. Like everything about her is horrible. She's like sexually assaulting people. She's beating people up in the cell. She's like this big figure of fear. And our main character slowly feeds her food with bleach in it until she dies, which horrifying.
But she's telling her it's medicine. She's still playing the part of like caretaker that kills it, which is funny because the people in prison know, all the people in prison that are like, you've changed after you got out. They all know that she murdered her in prison. And they all talk about that she fed her bleach. All like, so I'm like, you knew what she was capable of, but it was this. Yeah.
But I think that I think again, it was that they were all like, oh, she did it for us. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
Because they always have that. Because she has two nicknames, the witch and like the angel or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
And they're constantly calling her both of these names. And there's a voiceover that's like, even that is the day when she was given the title of witch, but everybody called her this other thing.
Yeah.
Which I think was really interesting too. So she saves her from the sexual assault by like, she like takes soap and like rubs the ground with it. So when the person's like leaving the bathtub, she slips and hits her head. And that's why she has to go to the hospital.
Yeah. Very funny.
Very silly.
Big pratfall.
Yeah.
There's a scene early on where she kneels down to pray. This is after she's gotten out of prison. And we cut to her dream of the man dog sled.
Yes.
What do you think about the man dog sled?
I had forgotten about the man dog sled. What a weird scene.
This is her like sitting down ostensibly to pray, and like her vision is of insane violent retribution in this like crazy hellish snowing landscape with like crazy mountains in the background where she's taken her abuser and fixed his head onto a dog that's also a sled that she's dragging across this landscape before she shoots him in the head.
Yep.
And that's it. You just get that. I think it's just this like visceral, I guess, just like representation of like the desire for vengeance. You're like, I want you to
and there's also
I
think that this movie also is very obsessed with like duality, because she has all of these crazy violent dreams and her plan is just murder, but she also keeps these candles lit as a shrine to the boy who was killed because she feels so much guilt about it. Right next to her own picture of her like police sketch.
Mm-hmm.
So she then goes and she gets a job at a pastry shop of a guy who is a pastry chef from Japan, but he was hit by a truck. And so he's kind of shaky and can't walk very well. And she's apparently like an amazing cake maker. And so she gets hired. And there's also this other guy who's like 20 years old, which is how old the young boy that she indirectly killed would have been. And they kind of start like a sexual relationship. But it also feels like it's very much made maybe for her to feel better about herself, to be like, look, I'm trying to repay this guilt or this sin, like you can have anything you want, essentially. It's interesting because otherwise I was like, I don't quite understand why she's doing it other than this person is sort of like a facsimile, like as close as she can get to that boy who died to forgive her. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't know how to read the sex scene with them.
Yeah.
I was like, or she's just like trying to, get her rocks off one more time before she finalizes her vengeance.
That also could be. That also
But
could be the case.
I think what you're saying is more, probably more profound and coherent than that.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, and it's around this middle point in the movie where you find out the reason that she went to prison after she sort of created all this thing, like all of these plans that are in motion. But one of the things that because all of the people that she meets are also like, have you done it? Have you killed him yet? And she says, no, I've been busy. And it cuts to her at the office, the adoption agency where her daughter was put up for adoption. And she's like, where is she? Can I talk to her? Can I meet with her? But she's horribly tied in knots about not being able to have been a mother to this child. Right.
Yeah.
And she wants to, again, find some sort of forgiveness or atonement there. And the people are like, no, you can't. We sent you this stuff like 20 years ago and you were not allowed to go visit them. So she literally breaks into the office like heist style. She like tapes the window, goes down from the roof and then smashes it with the window. I was like, this is badass. This is very cool. The whole way through, she's nothing but competent and focused. Like it's not as though she's just sort of like flopping around. And I think the gender politics of this movie are so interesting because all of the women in the jail cell with her are major characters. So this movie is like 90% women. It's really, really interesting. And they're all super interesting, fleshed out characters. They're not characters that just like all of them pass the Bechdel test because none of them care about men in that way. Like the movie is not focused on men at all, except for this one person who's become more of like a symbol of revenge than anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think he said as much. I think it's a pretty direct. He made this movie pretty directly in response to Old Boy, because Old Boy is. Have you seen Old Boy?
Not yet, but I want to see it now. I'm gonna probably see it in the next few weeks.
Cool. The Old Boy is focused on male protagonists and the one primary female character. Without revealing anything, it doesn't have a good time in the movie. And so I think he was like, I've made these two vengeance movies. I think he kind of jokingly was like, I'm going to make a trilogy. And so he's like, well, I have to make I said I would, I'll make a third one now. And so I think he went into it specifically like, I'd like to make a movie with a female lead and explore that perspective because I kind of feel guilty about the cultural presence of Old Boy and like what the character in that movie represents.
Absolutely.
And so, I mean, I think it's like a very, a true, like honest, and successful pursuit to, like you said, create a movie that is largely made up of female characters and like examining their relationships, like peer-to-peer relationships, like mentor relationships, mother-daughter relationships.
Also societal relationships.
This perception of her both as the criminal and as this like saintly figure. I think too, when she gets out, she doesn't like talking to the young man at the bakery. She insists that she did kill. Like she fully accepts her role as the killer.
Yeah.
I think partly to knowing that she has to do so to protect her daughter. Like we get all the stuff with the detective where the detective knows she didn't do it.
Yeah. Oh yes. Let's actually really get into the detective stuff because I think that relationship is fascinating. And it's actually tied directly into the pastry shop because there are these two people who come in and buy a cake and they're like, oh, is it you're this famous pastry chef from Japan, to the owner. And he's like, actually, no, she actually made this cake. And she comes out and it is the detective and his wife, and the detective put her away like 10 years ago. And they have this awkward sort of like they shake hands and it cuts back. And like you said, you see the detective be like, what color was like his favorite marble that he was holding while you suffocated him? And she's like, what does that matter? That doesn't matter. Like, I don't know. It's fine. I killed him. I'm doing a confession. And it becomes clear during like the reenactment of the murder again that she actually doesn't know any of the details. And he sort of helps her through it by like pointing to his watch and saying like, this is the color of pillow that you suffocated this kid with. And so she is able to kind of get through the reenactment without people figuring out that she wasn't the killer. However, it's like they have this really interesting relationship because once she finds out, and this is kind of the next plot point anyway, she finds out that there are multiple kids that have died and that this person is a liar and he doesn't kidnap them to like get money. He just doesn't like kids. And so he kidnaps them, gets the ransom, and then just kills them. Or actually he kills them first and then gets the ransom money with the audio recordings that he made of them.
Yeah, the kid with them was the first one. So there's this realization that if we had actually put him away, it's kind of like a trolley problem situation. She's like, because we didn't put him away, he killed all these other kids. And like, yeah, my daughter survived, but like, what of these other parents, essentially? Yeah.
And she finds that out because she actually, well, we'll go back a little bit. So she goes to Australia to meet her daughter, which is where she is. They have sort of an interesting relationship. She kind of ingratiates herself. She kind of is very good at playing a character. And so she ingratiates herself with the adopted family very quickly. But the daughter will not hug her and is very kind of separate. But eventually the daughter convinces her, like, I want to go back to South Korea with you. And it's to kind of bond, but also see South Korea. And the parents agree because the girl, and this is, again, another kind of comedic moment, but is also like, whoa, she is rejected. And then it just cuts to her holding a knife to her throat, being like, I want to go to South Korea. Kind of crazy.
Well, it parallels to one of the first things she does when she gets out of prison is she tries to atone to the parents of the kid by literally cutting off trying to cut off all her fingers in front of them to be like, my body, which I think is very Christian coded, very Bible coded. And they're like,
my physical suffering will prove my repentance.
And then the rest of the movie, she has this bandage on her finger. But I also think that's really interesting because like that attempt to do that would theoretically like render her physically unable to like complete the revenge she wants to do. So it's kind of like the atonement is almost like, she's like, this is the first step in the process. I need to go cut off all my fingers to atone for this. Next step in the process, torture and murder this man for revenge.
And they make it pretty clear too. It sort of knocks you over the head with what they're trying to do, because I think that there is an actual line that is like, and then it took all of the money from her time in prison to reattach the finger to her hand. So it's kind of like, the atonement was all of this time that she spent in prison and this physical action, and it all kind of wraps up so that it kind of gives her an out to be like, you're free. You've done it. You're free. But she can't stop. She has to go, like you said, on to the next part of the plan, which is this guy.
Yeah. And so, yeah.
But let's keep going because we're so close to the part where I feel like it flips to a different movie, which is she has her kids. She has this plan. The plan's going really well. The killer, we have this scene with the killer of him because he's a school teacher and he's teaching all these kids like Vereshaka, that kind of thing. Yeah. And then it goes to them sitting in his house and he's like eating with his partner and he just like gets up and rapes her. Like it's pretty horrifying actually, but it really makes you be like, wow, this guy's a psycho. Yeah. And it's like in the middle of the meal and it's very weird. It's a very off-putting and it's definitely like a power play and it immediately sets a tone for this character, which I thought was very effective. But then we see that like the wife or partner or girlfriend or whatever she is visits our main character and says like, even for you, I can't do another day of this. This is horrible. And they're like, okay, it's time. Tonight is when we're going to go kill him. But also the priest also saw this guy and is like being paid for pictures of her. That was the one plot point where I was like, I don't quite understand how these people know each other. Do you know what I mean?
It's unclear if he was like somehow involved from the beginning, the priest, or knew he's so desperate to be connected to her that, like, he might have known that they had a relationship before she went to prison. And so he knows to go. Yeah, I wasn't clear totally on that. But yeah, I do think it's interesting that, like, in this first half, it is this revenge saga. And there is some dramatic tension, but there's not a lot of tension of, is she going to do it or not? Like,
No, it's very clear she's going to do it the whole time.
right, because then they poison him and knock him out. Like, I think the closest thing you have is he sends the two goons after
Killers,
her.
yeah.
One of which is Song Kang-ho from Memories of Murder. And there's some tension there, but she dispatches them in front of her daughter pretty easily.
It's also, I think, really interesting because throughout the movie continuously kind of pushes back against our feelings of like, oh, she's too kind. She's like this sensitive woman. Obviously, she's not going to be able to kill people. And then there's that scene where they go out and she has the fox, that really adorable little fox, and she's testing the gun for the first time. And it's like whether or not she's going to shoot this really adorable little creature. And she blows its head off, immediately kills it.
It's
and
a
then
puppy, isn't it? Is it a fox?
I thought it was a fox,
puppy.
but maybe it's a puppy.
Oh.
It might be a puppy.
Anyways, yeah, that's it's a brutal scene. Yeah,
and it really pushes back. And it's like, no, there's no doubt. This person is like, she's cold. She's going to go do this. And there's this scene where the two goons try to kidnap her and her child and are using like chloroform, essentially. She's able to escape, takes out the gun, shoots one of them. The other one has her child, who is like, I'm not sure if she's passed out or not, but he has a knife to her throat. And she just slowly walks up to him and shoots him in the head, because you can only shoot that gun like close enough when you're right next to them. So she just like runs at him and then shoots him. And it's like a pretty crazy scene where it's like, oh, wow. And I think that is the flip. That is when the movie starts feeling like a different movie to me anyway. What about you?
Yeah, I think to me it's kind of when they get to the schoolhouse, but I guess it does kind of change there, because at that point it's inevitable.
Yeah.
She's going to get him. It's pretty simple. They just poison the food to knock him out.
Yeah. And she goes to the home and they grab him, they tie him up, all that kind of stuff.
And the first thing she does is cut his hair, which I think is really, it was just a wild, like, visceral thing of like, I don't know. I don't know if there was more to it, but it really just felt like that was just like her immediate emotional reaction, was just this like frustration and like need to like, I don't know.
It's like a rage
exactly
thing. It was really compelling, but also like kind of spooky. And also the shot was kind of silly, because when she like looks up at the camera, it's like, it makes her kind of look like a gremlin. But yes, it was, it's like a very intense moment where she's like crying and she's just like kind of screaming and doing this thing. And it's like really emotionally pretty severe.
Yeah. But yeah, basically at this point other than him translating for the daughter, he doesn't get anything else to say about his
which
character.
I love, because it's like you said, of the mythologizing of the serial killer. This kind of does the opposite, where they've
also, as a response to Old Boy, the actor who plays him is the protagonist of Old Boy, which is very interesting.
Interesting.
Like very, very different character in the movie.
Man, I can't wait to watch Old Boy now, because I wonder like what it's in conversation with. But let me just kind of speed through this part now. So she finds out that he has killed multiple kids. She finds the tapes and then brings the detective back in, like you said, and is like, they killed more after it because we fucked up. And then the detective's like, because she's like, you're the only one who knows how I'm feeling right now, like, because you also did this. And she's like, well, we should get all of the people together, all of the parents, and we should deal with it. And so they bring him out to this like abandoned school, bring all of the parents and play the tapes that they found of him killing their children. This is hard to watch. However, it's not brutal at all. Like, all of the bad stuff that happens on the tapes is off screen. It's kind of worse that way because you're imagining what happened to them. but you see the parents' reactions instead, and I found that really chilling. Like, it was really hard to sit through, but like very compelling.
Yeah, I find that, yeah, this is probably the hardest scene of the movie for me. I think hearing the children, you see one child be hanged briefly,
Yeah.
which is really hard. And even the way the
Yeah.
parents are the way the parents are introduced is pretty incredible though. It's
Yeah.
silent shots of each pairing and then a silent cut to them reacting. It's like a flash forward real quick. And it's just like really there's so much, like really novel, fascinating ways of conveying information in this movie that I love without just putting it through expository dialogue. You like pretty much immediately understand who they all are without them having to spell it out.
Yeah. And also at this point with the version that we watched or I watched, was that at this point you can really tell that the colors have sort of started draining out of this film. It's super desaturated. It's very almost like muddy and grayscale-y at this point, but not quite black and white yet. And from this point to the very end is just like a slow transition of this color scheme. But she basically says to all of the parents, if you want justice from the cops, the detective here will take him in and we will do that. If you want more personal justice, I have weapons and we can all go and do that. However, we all have to do it together. And there's sort of like a scene where they're all kind of talking. One guy's like, hey, my wife has a weak heart, but it's really him that doesn't want to do anything. And there's other people who are like, maybe we shouldn't, but then everyone kind of settles on the decision of like, we're going to go do this. And maybe the most like kind of cruel thing that she does, I think, is she hooks up a microphone in this classroom that is separate from where the killer is, so that as they are discussing how they're going to do this, the killer can hear everything in the room where he is in. And it has been set up with like plastic on the ground and lights and everything, very Dexter, because they're going to murder him. And so he's waiting for this to happen, which is really horrific. But
in before that, she also has the thing where her and her daughter don't speak the same language. So she has him translate all this stuff that she wants to say.
She has a gun to the back of his head. Yeah,
which is crazy. But I love the negotiation scene of them working out how exactly they're going to exact vengeance, how they're going to make sure that everyone's equally accountable and no one's just the talking through that I find compelling. And this movie too, like we said, like really balances like genre or not balance. I don't know if it even balances it. It's a wild like genre exercise where there's a crazy, even in this moment where like it has made this turn, he still like gets a joke out of it where the one guy the farmer guy has like what just looks like a short stick and someone's like, is that it? You can borrow my knife if you want. And then he pulls out the head of an axe and screws it on.
He screws it on. He's like, I think I'll be okay.
It is wild to just have that like be like, I'm gonna put a joke in here.
I mean, the movie is genuinely funny. There's a lot of jokes throughout, and there's like a lot of just like funny shots. Very much like Memories of Murder, where it's like, wow, is this an appropriate place for a joke? I guess so.
I'm like, I don't know if that's a Korean sensibility or if that's like these two directors are like some of the most famous Korean directors and have a lot of thematic similarities in their movies. So maybe it's just like a them two thing. But in my experience of Korean movies, they are these like broad, really not definable in genre super well.
And so then we just see each of the people mustering up the courage to go into the room and exact their vengeance by brutalizing him. Except you only ever really see them go in, make eye contact with the killer, and sometimes there's stuff being said, and then it cuts to them leaving the room, and usually they're like falling down or they are completely unable to hold up their own weight because they're just like so traumatized by what just happened, and they were the ones inflicting it, so again, it's like this brutality happens off screen, but your imagination from the context clues you're given is just like horrific, like whatever happened in there was horrible. But also like there's this really interesting point that again is very much like Memories of Murder, like the last line where she says like, why did you do it? Like, why did you do this? And the killer looks at this mother and says, well, nobody can be perfect. And then it cuts to her stumbling out of the room all with blood all over her like poncho that she has. And it's like, oh
Yeah.
God. So they all go through and different things happen. There's this like really sad thing where one of them talks like the farmer family that's like poor, because all of them sent their kids to this prestigious English school, and that's where the guy worked. And so they were all rich, and that's why they could pay the ransom. But this farmer family was like, we saved for years to get enough money to send our kid there. And then when the ransom came, we did everything we could. We took loans out against our house. We lost our house. Our family doesn't talk to us anymore. We're like in financial ruin. And then this old woman is like, my other daughter killed herself, or my daughter-in-law, the mother of this boy, killed herself. And the father won't talk to me anymore and has left the country.
Yeah.
And she's like, we all have our stories. And it's like, wow, brutal. Like, it's just like kind of continuously building. It's like sort of justification, but at the same time, it never is, because they all are horrified by what they do to this guy.
Yeah. And I think they make him, it seems like they make him as evil as possible. He's killing children. He's extracting ransom after he's already killed the children. And he's doing it to buy a yacht, is what they say. There's no...
Yeah, it's to buy a yacht. And that was it. Because he got paid well at the school, so he didn't need the money.
So I think they're like, what is the most evil person we can take? We're going to tell this story of extremely justified vengeance and still like ask the question at the end, like, is it worth it? Do you get anything from this?
Yeah. So then the guy's dead. The grandmother goes and sticks a pair of scissors from her granddaughter into the back of his neck to kill him, which, very thematic. And then there's also another detective moment, which I love, which is before they all start going into the room, he is teaching them how to use a knife, because they're just people. And he's like, when you stab someone, don't hold it like this, because your hand could slip up. You could cut yourself. We don't want anyone to get hurt. Like, it's like this really weird moment where he's like doing some safety stuff with them. And it's really horrific. But then at the end, they sort of like, they're cleaning up. So they're mopping all the blood. They're like, they puncture the net or the big tarp that they put down, and all the blood drains out into a bucket. They throw the body on sort of like an, gurney, and they all kind of walk out into the woods and bury him out there. And that's when our main character comes up and shoots him twice in the head, and then throws the gun inside of the grave as well. And then they bury him, and they all go to this restaurant it's the pastry place, the bakery, where she has made this beautiful cake for them to all have some of. And there's this very long scene of her just passing out this cake with one of the others, and they sit down and they just eat this cake, and they all just kind of like talk. And then one of them is like, when the conversation like pauses and there's a break, some say that that's when like angels are flying by overhead, and you hear like the dingling of a bell, which I thought was very Miracle on 34th Street or whatever it is, the one where it's like whenever an angel gets its wings kind of thing. So they all have this moment, and then the other guy who works at the pastry place comes in, and they all just sort of leave. And they also have a moment where they all write down their account numbers, and they're like, can you send us the money, the ransom that we paid back? And she's like, yeah, I can do that. And I didn't know whether or not that was sort of like a money is gross sort of thing. These people care about money even in this kind of crazy situation. Like, what did you read out of that moment?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily like saying anything too bad about them, but that it is like still a transactional experience at the end of the day. Like, they are looking for vengeance, but
and like I guess a more sympathetic reading would be like, maybe they will be made whole as much as possible. Like everything that was theirs is going to be returned except for their kids, essentially.
Yeah, that's true.
But that's like a very generous reading, because there is a look that she has, which feels kind of strange, but
a little bit. I think there could be both, though, because it is this idea of like, you can get literally everything else material back except your child. Yeah. And like, is it worth it? There's also the thing where the one guy starts singing happy birthday, and he's
and they're like, oh, I felt like it was a birthday.
Yeah, he's like, I'm sorry, I don't know what I was like.
Yeah.
That part is, yeah, because it's a movie that's really horrific, but it's not. That was the one part that almost like moved me to tears a little bit, because that just feels very human in light of all this like kind of cold, calculated revenge stuff.
The movie never is like these people are cruel and awful. They are just doing this cruel thing because of how awfully something happened to them. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting, and it also kind of sets up the ending for Guamja, who is now like kind of walking home because they all leave. She sees the ghost of the murdered child, and she tries to apologize, but he essentially like stops her from talking and walks away, not giving her the chance to try to apologize, which I thought was interesting, and you could read in 100 different ways.
Yeah, and that part's super interesting. I mean, she talks about before this idea of him presenting himself because he shows up to her daughter.
Yeah.
And yeah, she sees the adult version of him, which is also, I keep bringing it back to this, but the casting is very interesting because that actor is an old boy too. And an old boy, he's playing like, I think like in his 40s or 50s, which is insane in Old Boy. I think it's a choice in Old Boy that he's like, he's got a very youthful face. I'm like, it's very funny. He's like playing like 20 in this, but like,
I know, right? It's just crazy.
I think it might also just be like a little wink, wink, nudge, nudge to people that saw Old Boy to be like, oh, look who it is. But yeah. That's really, and then you get the very last scene of the
very last scene, which I think is super powerful, because that her daughter comes and she starts crying and hugging her and all this kind of apologizing because her daughter wanted her to apologize. And so she finally kind of does this. She does it earlier too when the guy's translating for her, but this is her. And then she takes out this white cake and says, like, Jenny, her daughter, like, you have to be like this cake. You have to be pure and white and like never let sin like take you. Very biblical again, but it's sort of like, don't be like me, essentially. And then Jenny eats some of the cake and is like happy, and then like takes some of the icing and offers it to her mom, and her mom can't eat it. And then she puts her face in the cake and begins to sob.
Yeah.
And that's sort of how the movie ends.
Yeah.
In a weird way.
Yeah. And I think it is this kind of like also like uncertain ending of like, is she putting her face in there as like emotional catharsis, or is she putting her face in there as like resignation to like, after all
I kind of feel like in my reading of it, at least, it's because she knows that she can't forgive herself. She's never going to be able to get that clean feeling again. And so she's just sobbing, you know? Jenny goes back to Australia, and it is revealed that the voiceover person the whole time has been Jenny.
Right.
And is commenting about her mom. And so it's sort of like a full circle moment there as well. Yeah. And that's the end of the movie. Let me just give my brief thing, and then I just want to throw it to you to see what you thought. This movie, I thought, it went down a lot easier than Memories of Murder for me. The first half does feel like a heist movie. It feels very easy to watch. It's just sort of like ta-tum, 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 one thing to the next thing. It's like the plan is being implemented, and that's very satisfying. Then we get to the schoolhouse, and it is harrowing. It is horrifying to watch. And it's just, look at the psychology of what this revenge actually brings to people. And then you have the resolve afterwards of like, was it even all worth it? And I just thought it was such an intimate, interesting look at vengeance, because like Tony Zhao in the Every Frame of Painting video that you mentioned that I really resonate with. And I thought that he was right. The whole thing is like, in vengeance movies or revenge flicks, the protagonist has to pay a price for breaking society's rules. And Gamja's punishment is that she is never going to feel like she is okay again. She is always going to feel this horrible guilt and suffer for it for the rest of her days. At least the movie implies that. You can never get clean again. And I thought that was a really like interesting meditation on revenge, because she was totally justified. She did it in a very cold, calculated way. And she did it in a way that was not Like she could have tried to feed him through like a meat grinder or whatever, and that may have been like a little bit different. But instead, she lets the parents have closure for what they have suffered through, even though it's kind of like a very specific, horrific type of it. But even if, but even doing this for all the right reasons, in the end, she is still cast out of society as somebody who will never be able to forgive herself and will never be able to like be a full person, because she's always going to be haunted by this. And I thought that was just really, really interesting, very intimate, very emotional, very compelling story to watch.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it is this idea of like she does it all right. It's the most justified revenge you can imagine, and done in a way designed to bring some sense of justice to the people that have been wronged most. And it still, is somewhat hollow in the end. It's not clear what exactly it accomplishes. And if she can really like ever forgive herself for it. And I think it's really compelling. I think all the three of the Vengeance trilogy deal with that question in some way. I think watching them, this one was the most effective and like compelling to me in that respect. The I mean it's interesting. I think we do feel opposite about like content wise. I think this movie upsets me a lot more than Memories of Murder. I don't know if it's just the specific things that happen and are a little more I don't know. It's more, I don't know what it is. I think it is kind of because it's these like horrific acts that are meant to like paint him as like the worst possible person versus the more like interpersonal, not interpersonal, kind of like interpersonal violence and abuse of Memories of Murder. Or maybe Memories of Murder too is it's like, well, also like, they're cops. It's not as maybe it's not as shocking in like I found this movie kind of shocking the first time I watched it, and maybe in Memories of Murder, like once you understand, or I felt like, oh, I understand who these characters are, so I'm not like as shocked that they're acting in such a immoral and like unethical way. I think too, I've said this to you when I first time I watched this movie, I took an edible and it hit.
That is such a bad decision.
I mean, think about the first half though, feels like, oh, this could be a fun edible movie.
This is great.
And then it really kicked in when they get to the schoolhouse, which is the worst time for an edible to kick in.
Yeah.
So maybe that like colored my thing about it's just like, okay.
But no, I mean, it is horrific. I think that I agree that I think that we feel opposite about these. I think the main thing for me while you were talking that came up was Memories of Murder made me feel very impotent as an audience member as well, which is, part of the whole thing. He's trying to make you feel like you have no like choice. These people are doing these things, you can't stop it. There is no good person to really ally yourself with in the movie. Like as an audience, you can't kind of like say that's my stand-in or whatever. And so you just had to witness horrific violence that was senseless, and that made me feel it was really hard for me. I think that honestly the senselessness of it was the hardest part, like watching that handicapped man just be beaten to the point where he like could barely walk and was like still trying, and then they would like switch to him being like, oh, come on, it's okay, we're not trying to hurt you, and the other guy would step on his face again. Like it's like, whoa, Jesus Christ, this is just cruelty and violence. Whereas in Memories of Murder, in Lady Vengeance, the violence is still like probably on the same tier level of like, this is horrific, this is hard to watch. However, it made more sense to me. Like if the violence that we witness, that our the audience's characters, sort of the good guys, I'm using air quotes, the violence that they enact is justified in some way in our minds, right? And maybe this is also the trick of the storyteller as well. Is it justified? At the end, we kind of think maybe not. But you have the feeling during the moment of like, this person did a horrible thing. is unrepentant, is a monster, and these people are taking their just desserts. You know what I mean? Whereas Memories of Murder, it felt a lot more arbitrary and hard to watch and experience because of that.
Yeah.
I'm still kind of rock tumbling that theory, but I think that's why I had a harder time with Memories of Murder than Lady Vengeance.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's fair. I think that's, a totally valid perspective on the movies. But it's, I mean, I love talking about these because I'm like, I do think
they're both so good. They're both such good movies.
Truly. I really, these are both highly rated movies for me. And yeah, I don't know. I think it is just blowing my mind a little bit because in my head I was like, well, yeah, Lady Vengeance has like objectionable content that I wouldn't like. I feel like I even said like Lady Vengeance is the tougher one to watch. So like, no, it's good that it's giving me a different perspective on Memories of Murder. Haven't seen it a few times.
But the thing is like the feelings that I got out of both of those movies, I think were incredibly intentional by the directors, which to me is like, I may not like it or whatever, but they're entirely successful films. Like Memories of Murder, that impotence that I'm feeling as an audience member watching it and the rage that I'm feeling is exactly what he wants you to feel, because that's what the moment was with this sort of like the end of this dictatorship, the powerlessness, but still the militaristic control of the populace beginning to be angry at that kind of control. And like, it put me there. I was like, these fuckers are just beating up whoever they want. They're just, then they're idiots. They're not even succeeding at anything. How dare they? And that is exactly what the director probably wanted me to feel. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think in both cases, just like the absurdity of both, the absurdity in this case of these, people commanding respect and authority in this situation. And it does like play for comedy. And then in this one too, the kind of almost, the absurdity of like, well, what do what do you like? Yeah. Do you really think that you can erase this trauma by committing righteous violence of your own? Like what did you expect to happen? Kind of.
Yeah.
Which I think, part of why I love both of these movies. And I think like Bong Joon-ho really speaks to me as a director. Someone like the Coen brothers movies is these like genre crossing things that have elements of comedy and absurdity within these like horribly violent stories. I don't know, makes them more.
They both made me chuckle as well. So like, so really crazy filmmaking. Like, wow, what just masters of their craft that in the same movie you can be like, wow, I'm disgusted. I feel like I want to throw up. And also that was really funny.
Yeah, it's great. But
so which one are you gonna say is your favorite? It's Memories of Murder?
Memories of Murder is up there, is the one for me.
And I think I'm gonna do Lady Vengeance, which I think means that this is our very first verse.
Wow. Is this the first time for the two of us that we've had?
I think we usually agree, or at the very end, we talk each other into each other's sides. But I think this is the first one we were like, no, I think this is
how exciting!
We're ending on separate sides.
We coined the phrase and got to use it all in one episode.
And the very first time.
Beautiful.
But yeah, we will be back in 2 weeks. We're sorry that this didn't come out in the first week of the month, but it turns out this is a 5-week month. So we're coming out at the usual schedule. So we're going to have another Culture Boys in 2 weeks on Monday. And we will see you all very soon. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Movie versus movie. Movie versus movie.